The Fishing Gurus Podcast.
In this conversation, folks, me and Bagger are going to be Kinder Pot kids. How do you fancy that?
I like Kinder Pot kids, yeah.
I like Kinder Chocolate. Do you like Kinder Chocolate?
Yeah, I do actually. I'm not a chocolate lover, but Kinder Surprise is one of my favourites.
Right nice, right nice. I want to talk to you about pole pots, Bagger, because in my time in the fishing trade, used to work at the magazine, I can remember very vividly coming out with you on features, and in particularly you, and I was always amazed at how in-depth you got about talking about pole pots and how your bait comes out of them. And even 6, 7, 8 years ago, I know you were tweaking them then and making your own adjustments. And it's a massive part of so many people's fishing nowadays. Commercial venues, even natural venues as well. So many anglers use pole pots. So I'd like to pick your brains, talk a little bit about the development of pole pots and kicking off. I mean, for you, when did you first start using them and start seeing them?
So I'm probably thinking back like 20 years ago when I first started my fishing, if you like. I'd have been like 15-year-old or something, 16-year-old. Brookside's fishery in Warrington. That was sort of my first taste of commercial fishing. That's where I won my first match. And all anybody used to use was the yellow Kinder Surprise pots.
Right.
You know, dead lightweight, didn't weigh nothing, very thin plastic. And we just used to drill an hole in. Some people put rubber grommets either side and they look really good. You
can remember them, like little soft black ring around the edge of the plastic.
Yeah, I remember seeing them. I remember an angler called Clive Munslow who used to fish down at Morelands Farm. He used to fish worms and that in them. I always used to look at his potted magazine and think, oh, that's neat. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like rubber grommets or whatever they were. I don't know what he did, but it was smart. It held it in position. But yeah, that's the first sort of pole pot I seen. And then I remember a pot that an older lad who used to fish at Brookside, Alan Metcalf, he used to have one of the screw-on ones. So it was like you clipped it on and you screwed your pot and it tightened up, but it was very unbalanced. It was like not centralised or anything.
Yeah.
And that was a long, slim pot.
I can remember them. I crushed so many pole tips using them as a kid.
Yeah.
Remember my dad used to come in a pack and they were all inside each other, different sizes.
They might have been Vespa or something like that. Maybe.
Yeah, I think they were.
But then we used to like cut down the yellow Kinder Surprise ones. I used to have tons of them, but I got my gear robbed last year, so I can't really show you. I had an old Kinder Pot Surprise one that was from my dad's tackle.
Really?
And I kept it. And it was just basically used to heat up a bit of metal, push it through, and then you just make the hole smaller. And you just mess about on a Friday night and just, oh, that just fits nice on my top kit.
Yeah.
And then you'd have to do the other side the other way because obviously it'd be a bit thicker and thinner. And we used to fish them like this far back from our poles back then. Do you know what I mean? Like now we're right on the end of our pole. We'd be like this far back. Oh, this, I've overdone the hole on this one. It'd slide up your pot.
Like 8 or 10 inches down your pole tip.
We didn't realise how accurate it needed to be. But they were sort of the first things. And then obviously coming into winter, they're just way too big. Then we started fishing with lids on them. So instead of chopping the pot off with the Kinder Surprise, obviously you used to open it up. So then we used to close it. And for maggots or micras, you just put little holes in and it'd be a pepper pot. So you could fill it up, pepper pot it. Like, you know, we use this sort of thing today for maggots.
Yeah,
like a sprinkle lid. We can open them up dead easy, put your maggots in, tap a few in. That's why the pot's red. But back then it was like I had pot with a hole on top and I cut it like that. So it'd be like a hole. So I'd chop it out with scissors, make it smaller, bit bigger if you wanted to empty them quick. It used to be like, oh, double kindering maggots across, because obviously a normal pot would be a Kinder pot, and then you put the lid on, we call it double kindering maggots. We used to do that at the Oaks Lakes at Sesse and stuff like that.
Wow.
You know, you'd fill it up to the brim, you'd ship across, and it'd be like, get about 100 maggots in it. It'd be like probably feeding one of them.
Yeah.
Double kindering maggots, that was really good. And then obviously we moved on to like winter pots, so fruit shoot lids were popular.
You still see an odd person with fruit shoot lids now.
Well, they were perfect. They were clear. They were lightweight. You'd just put a bit of plastic through the little holes that they have, and you'd fold it over your pole and like wrap it over, and it'd trap it in position. But you could only ever feed once with it. You'd like press your pellets in, and you'd tap your bait out back then. Whereas obviously now things have developed. You know, we realise fish respond to noise. So you tap your bait in, you get a liner. Now it'd be like, right, I'll just sneak my bait in. So I need holes to push that pellet out nicer, and things just developed. You know, I remember we used to get 2 kinder pots, and we'd basically like, say you get 2 pots together. I think someone's glued that one on. So you get 2 pots together, and I glued them together.
Yeah.
So I glue them together like that, and then the top one, you chop the middle out, and we could never get a lid for it. But we wanted basically what we've got now. Obviously, we're lucky now. We can have it all made for us. We can just fill it up with micros, tap a few in, little sprinkle lid.
Yeah.
But back then, I remember Paz used to deliver, and he used to deliver all these gum shields and that.
Right.
And he got some gum shield things made. So say I had a pot that big, he had these lids made for us all. Well, about 4 or 5 of us, and it just fit perfect on. And it was a soft plastic, and then we'd have one with a hole in the middle, one with 3 holes in, and we'd just drill the holes in this plastic. And Paz would just bring them us. It'd be like, so for years when we used to fish the winter leagues at Partridge and stuff like that, Paz was like bringing us these lids. Nobody else had them, so we could go out, tap 4 maggots in. You know, nobody had the right pots and stuff like that. So
did you tell anyone, or did you just keep it a bit of a secret?
Get me some, like, you know, Paz would be like, no chance, like, do you know what I mean? But he had them moulded to the size. Just basically give it to the guy and said, can you make me a mould for the top of that? So he moulded it over the top. It was this really soft plastic that you could pick off dead easy, fill your pot up. It went on dead easy, but it never come off when you tapped it. And then we just drill the holes to suit. Obviously, that's where all these developed from. So you have like little holes now. If I was fishing with 6mm pellets, that'd be my hole that I'd go to.
Yeah.
Because they'd bounce out of that bigger hole. But if you wanted a fast release of bait, say 4mm or micros or maggots, you'd go for the small rim, and then we'd have like the medium sort of rim, and then obviously we have as pepper pot starts, the dial ones, and then they just develop from there really. So
what's what was is there any particular venues or particular matches that stick out in your mind where you can remember making a big finding about pots, like where you've gone, oh my god, I've adapted that and it has made a massive difference to my fishing?
Yeah, like when I first used to go to Westwood and fish the festivals there were so many F1s that come in your peg. The biggest thing was not feeding a lot of bait. So I used to use a little fruit shoot or one of these chopped down in half. Like we do a slightly smaller one on that, but it didn't empty well because the holes are too small.
Yeah.
So I used to chop the holes bigger on that, cut this down, because half of one of them small gurus, a full one of them was too much bait.
Wow.
And that you're catching 150, 200 pound doing that. But you're catching fish this big. And the key was, if you fed too much bait and the fish was still in your peg, say you put 100 micros in, them fish might take 3 minutes to clear it out. If you put 20 in, there's so many fish, they come straight in, eat it, they clear your peg out, there's nothing there. So you put another 20 in, they come back in. So it weren't about having lots of fish tailing in your peg, it was about feeding the right amount of bait, but making minimum noise. So obviously you'll see on some of these pots, all my holes are drilled out. I've got bigger holes in the bottom to help flush the bait out, so that basically I can put my pot on the water. I don't have to tap it or anything. My bait will melt out. I can lift my pot off. There's no noise. You
must have been one of the founders of that. So many people do it now, where they let the water flush bait out of the pot, and it makes such a massive difference. But I'm sure you must have been one of the founders of that. Can you remember anyone telling you? Or?
No, I think I've always messed about with pots as a kid. So lids and stuff, I've messed about with them since I was younger. But the first place it ever was apparent to me was when I used to go Partridge and the fish was smaller. Every time you made noise, you get liners, but you could never catch the fish in the edge. You'd feed maggots or casters or pellets. They'd never come off the bottom, but you'd always get liners if you made any noise. And I was feeding, and it's like I would go in fishing 3-4 times a week at the time there, and it's like the same thing happens over and over again. It's like fishing is just about problem solving, isn't it? So it's like, I've got a problem here, I'm getting linered to death. They're coming to the noise, right? So I don't want any noise, do I? Obviously,
even when you're potting, you're getting liners.
Yeah, so you pot your bait, and most people go in and be like, tap your bait in, liner.
That was the thing. You could hear people tapping the pole, couldn't you, around the lake?
That's all you'd hear out lake. Pellet fishing, it'd be cross the island, tap your bait, or put it on the water and tap the bait. And it was a case of then, like, you sneak your bait in, don't make any noise. People still make the mistake now of lifting the pot off too fast, and then it either mushrooms your bait, and your bait goes everywhere. So you've got to wait for your bait to melt out, and it'll fall in a tighter pile rather than mushroom out. And also, like, when you lift it off, you're making noise.
Cause it like just...
Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's like a fish, like, you know, did you see that behind you? No, didn't hear anything. But then if it's like, it just gets your attention. So any noise, when there's a lot of fish in your peg, it was like they respond to it. That's why tapping the water works so well, slapping your pole rig. You could have a little dibber on that big and you slap it, don't make much noise, but the fish respond to it straight away. I
suppose if you're trying to catch them on the bottom, they're looking up, and really you want them looking down, don't you?
Exactly that. So it's like, I'm doing it all the time, and it's like, I need to... How can I get these pellets to like not make any noise? So you put it on the water and it comes out, but it don't. You've still got a few pellets in the bottom of your pot. So you cut your pots right to the base so it flushes them out. And then obviously I had a hand in designing these guru pots where there's holes in the bottom and in the side. So your standard pot would come with little holes like this.
Yeah.
So they're great because I can put my maggots in there. I can dunk my maggots and the maggots can't get out. That pot now is no good for maggots because they'll crawl out the bottom. The holes are too big. But this pot, the maggots won't come out. So then I was like, well, if I cut the bottom of that, that'll help flush it out. So now I have what I call my clumping pots. So I have a range of pots like that. They're my 4 clumping pots. They're all cut out for pellets and ground baits and anything. And then I'll have the same where I've got a pepper pot for maggots. I've got an open top lid for maggots, a little sprinkle pot for pellets. And then I'd have a medium pot, which I'd use for 6mm pellets. Like, every single bait requires a different presentation. Do you know what I mean? We have maggot feeders. We have open cage feeders, window feeders. Like, it's so important that you have the right pot to deliver your bait into your peg correctly. And some baits you want noise. I always think hard pellets, excuse me, 4, 6, 8mm pellets, they sink pretty quick. So your attraction with hard pellets is noise. But when you're fishing with ground bait and micros and mushy meat and worms, chopped worms in soil and stuff like that, a lot of it comes to the cloud. So if you make a cloud and noise, you've got double the attraction. But that's going to lead to line as you foul up fish. And it was first apparent to me, I was using tiny, tiny little pots, feeding 20 micro pellets and catching these big weights of fish. And, you know, I was catching like 150, I think my best weight was 196 pound on a top kit in the edge.
At Westwood?
Yeah, on the Osprey. And fished in the edge all day. And you could either catch them shallow, where you're throwing bait and making noise, getting them to look up, or you could catch them in the edge. The biggest mistake a lot of people used to make is they throw bait, make noise, spread the bait, too much bait in the peg. They'd be like tails everywhere down the edge because there's so many fish. And then they just have a nightmare with it. Whereas I'd like be never missing a bite. Do you know what I mean? It'd be like in feed. You wait 25 seconds, but then you up one, you get it in. You're catching a fish a minute. You'd still be able to catch 200 fish fishing down the edge on a top kit. Whereas people would have more fish in the peg, but they just weren't catching them. And that was all down to the pot. It was the same when we fished across on the Skylark. It was all about making little bit of noise, no noise whatsoever, minimum noise, but using the right amount of bait. So that, because you was fishing for 3-4 pound carp on there, that small pot didn't work the same. You had to feed a little bit more.
What, to get them to come in?
To get them to
more
come in.
bait to go, come on lads, this is where the bait is.
But then when you fished in the edge, same depth, same fish. Well, no, the fish was a little bit bigger stamp in the edge, but same depth, same sort of fishing. That little pot never worked because you never had that volume of fish coming in your peg. So then you'd be feeding aggressive and you'd be using a large pot, like 3 times as much bait, because you had to draw them into your peg. Whereas across, they were already in your peg. Because it was F1s on the Osprey and Falcon, they were already in your margin because they were just on your bait. There's so many fish. And that's when I realised, like, picking the right size pot, making sure your bait comes out of it correctly for whatever pot, whatever bait it may be, whether it's 6mm pellets, maggots, if it's tapping maggots in the winter, like, there's a certain lid and a certain size portion of bait that you need to be feeding. So to me, it's, you know, sorry, but for me, pole pot's like, it's all about feeding fishing. It's such an important part of your fishing.
Do you for people listening? Obviously, I'm looking there, and you've got pots with no lids, pots with big holes, pots with little holes, pots with sprinkles lids. Like as a little guide, which one exactly would you use when?
So if I was fishing micros in the winter, that's the pot I would use. Little tapping in micros. Maggots are a bigger particle than micros, so you can only get about 30 in there. So that's why that one's taped up, so they can't crawl out, because I'll be sat there for quite a while and I might go 8 or 10 maggots. 8 or 10 maggots. I get 4 or 5 feeds out of that pot.
So you'll happily fill your pot up and feed several times while you're fishing one line.
And what I'll do with this pot is I'll fill it up with micros, not to the brim because it won't empty. So 3/4 fill it, and then I purposely dunk it under the water, and my micros will clog up. Because if you're fishing in the winter and it takes 10 micros to get a bite, what you don't want to do is spill your bait. And if you leave them dry and you miss a bite, you feed. Or you shit back, you're playing a fish and you're spilling micros all the way across your peg. You're feeding your peg almost. 10 micros will get you a bite, and you're spilling 30 on the way back. So
how many people must do that and not even think about it?
So I'll be like, dunk my pot, purposely clogs my pot up, and then I have to physically bang the pellets out. Right, there's 10 pellets. In the depth of winter.
Yeah.
You get away with it now in October, but it's like, that's how anal I am with it. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you've got to be really, really...
So when you say you're dunking it, just for purpose of people who might not understand, you nearly fill it with micros.
3/4 fill it.
And then dunk it under the water, let it all drain out, and that water sticks them together in your pot.
Yeah, and that's why you need these pot holes here. These are drainage holes. They help release your bait, but they're mainly drainage holes. Like, it releases the water. So if I put my maggots in there, all my maggots will want to crawl out. So what I do, I dunk it under the water, it sucks your maggots in, and because they're wet, it gives you time to ship out without bouncing. I can just tap them all in one go.
Yeah. Because you look so smooth when you're shipping out, and you never seem to spill any bait, and you see other people really struggling, and there's maggots plopping out as they go out. But if you just dunk it in, the water sticks them into your pot, sort of thing. Yeah,
and if you've got the wrong pots, you can't do it. So like, you can pretty much do it with all these. Do you know what I mean? Back in the day, that's the pot we used to use for maggots down middle before we had the Guru ones. That was the old Preston Blue one.
Wow, let's have a look. I can remember them.
That was an old Preston Blue one. That old 25 maggots. It was like a nice amount for maggot fishing. Obviously now we've got multiple options. We can have sprinkle lids. We've got medium Gurus. I also have cut down medium Guru because we don't have a pot in between the medium and the small. So I've purposely still chopped this down because I want that volume of bait. And I've told Rooney for ages, he's like, just half fill it. And I'm like, no, I want to know exactly what I'm feeding. Put half in. I'm like, no, Roons. So, you know, we're actually tweaking these as we speak to try and get them even better. Everything evolves. And, you know, finally he's like, right, you tell me what you want and we'll work on it. And, you know, between a few of us, we're trying to come up with something even better. Even though they're usable, you can always improve things. It's like, right, let's do something even better now. It's like, we want something that releases this, we want something that holds this amount of bait. Because the amount of times I've fished over the years, and I basically have a set rule now where, so for example, if I'm fishing micro pellets, say spring, autumn, summer, that cut down medium, or the medium, that one, which I've cut out for clumping, I'd happily use them 2 pots for pellets. But if I'm fishing for F1s, I would never fish that much and that much pellet. There's too much bait, pellets, micro pellet wise.
Why is it too much, Bagger? It's
just too much for F1s. They don't like big portions of bait. You'll catch a couple of fish on it, but after 10 or 15 feeds, you'll just notice your catch rate will slow down. It's just happened for the last 15 years. You get to know they won't take that much bait. But if I was carp fishing, I would never use that and that. It would always be that one and that one.
Right.
So they're me. But then if I'm fishing ground bait, because ground bait's not as much food content and it's not as filling as micro pellets, I would never use that for ground bait for F1s. I might use that if it's really cold, but 95% of the time, they're my 2 ground bait pots for F1s. If I'm carp fishing, I never use that because it's not enough hardly. unless I'm fishing in, say, really shallow water, 10 inches on a mud line. It's nearly always that for me carp fishing.
Because they're more aggressive
It's
fish.
It's just they eat more. You know, the appetite of a 10 pound carp is a lot more than a pound F1. It's just like a 4-year-old and a 30-year-old. You know, the appetite's going to be different.
Brenda or Pazza.
Exactly.
That's the comparison, isn't
Brenda
it?
is going to eat a lot more than Paz because he's not a big eater. He'd be like, why have you messaged me on your podcast? Why are you taking Nick out of me? You fall out, you know. He's a great guy.
It's really interesting though, mate. It is so interesting. And for something that I think people take for granted, it's good to have a little natter about, you know, how you can get the best out of it. If I had to say to you, you're only allowed to use one pot for the rest of your life out of that collection you've got in front. And by the way, I'm loving the scruffy, damp. I mean, there's bits of white. I'll get Toby to do a close-up on this, folks.
I will get Sam,
But there's like, that looks like a scientific experiment that's going on in there. There's that much fur and fluff and mould.
There's a lot of lids.
It's great.
We've got some great mould there, haven't we?
If you had to pick one to use, which one would you pick?
To do a bit of everything, like the pepper lid would be no good. It'd have to be like a medium open.
Yeah.
Or maybe a large open.
But I can see even there, you can't make a decision,
No,
can you?
because you couldn't fish. That would never be enough for carp fishing. So I'm thinking, well, I could half fill that one. Do you know what I mean? It's like, but then it'd be a nightmare if it's open in the winter. It'd probably be like a large open.
Tell me a little bit about, before we go, tell me a little bit about the accuracy factor. How important is it to be accurate, and how much of a advantage is it? Because I sometimes see people fishing, or a lot of times I see people fishing with pole pots, and they'll plop the bait in and put the rig in somewhere near it. How much do you actually concentrate on your accuracy when you're using these kind of things?
I literally want to be fishing in a pint glass. You know, I put a pint glass there. That's the circumference I'd want to be fishing in. 3-inch square or whatever it is, 3-inch circumference.
Very accurate.
Yeah, so you've got to take into account as well, your pole pot will be on the end of your pole. I have it about 1 inch back so it don't catch me elastic. So you've got 1 inch back, but you've also got to compensate that when you're fishing here and you bring your pole back towards you, your pole's going to come here. So you have to compensate and lean forward 1 inch or 2 for that as well. And that's a big thing I see people do, is like when you ship out, it's going to come back towards you. It doesn't just go straight down parallel with ground. You'd have to feed like that to do that. So as you dip your pole, if you're fishing at further distance, it might end up 2 or 3 inch back, which doesn't sound a lot. But I've had pegs where I'm fishing on a mud line and I've got 2 inches and the shelf drops off. And I'm fishing right up against that bank and I've plumbed it and I've got a bit of tape on my pole and I'm sitting in the same position and I think, right, I've got to lean forward, feed my bait, now I'm back on my marker, push my rig in. The amount of people, when I've coached in the past and stuff like that, I can go on the box and I catch a few fish, they can get on the box and I'm like, you're 3 inches back, you're 4 inches back, you're not on the bottom, you're off the bottom by 1 inch and you're not going to get a bite. So accuracy is ridiculous. That's why a method feeder, a hybrid feeder is so good, because everything's in one little spot and you can chuck it in and where you feed is where your hook bait's going to be, in and around that area. With pole fishing, yes, you can be more accurate, but you've still got to line your pole up, sit in the right position. You've got to lean forward to compensate. Otherwise, you're going to be a few inches out, which doesn't sound a lot. But if I feed my bait here, my hook bait's here, the fish are just going to bypass that hook bait. You'll see the fish tailing up, and then they lose interest. You think, I've not had a bite then.
How often do you hear people say, I've had them in my peg, I could see them tailing up and I just couldn't catch them?
He's got to be super accurate, and I think that was one of my biggest edges. I think it's shown the most when Westwood was really good, and it's still brilliant now, but when you were catching like 200 F1s and there was 150 pound on any peg on Skylark, it was all down to micros and expander fishing. So you're feeding with a pole pot, you're not loose feeding anything. And my results stood out for like 5 years. I managed to win the festival 5 years on the trot.
That's ridiculous.
At a venue that I only went twice a year. So it weren't like my local venue, but the same principles applied. It was just working out what pot size to use. And all the lads that come with us, they all did well as well, because they knew or most of them did after a while. Do you know what I mean? But the first couple of years, it was so obvious what was working. And you'd speak to people after the match, and they'd be like, "I've just had loads of fish in my peg, and I was foul looking at them, and it's the worst thing you can do is start throwing bait on venues like that. You know, you've got to be super accurate, right amount of bait, really on top of that bait as well. So when they come in, the pile of bait is the size of your palm. They've got no option but to eat from that pile of bait, and then you're gonna get a lot more mistakes by the fish then.
If your hook bait is accurately on it. So it's really interesting, because if I asked you about the accuracy factor, when you explained about the difference that you come closer in when you drop your pole, so many people listening must have gone, clever devil, like I'd have never... So many people will not have thought about that when you're fishing on a little tiny shelf. And,
they probably won't, because they don't see it when they're fishing. But obviously when I'm coaching, I'm watching someone fish down the edge, and his float is here, and I watch him and his pole tip goes like this, and I'm like, you're 3 inches short of your float. You need to lean forward to compensate for that. So you learn by watching other anglers as well. Like, he's not being very accurate, do you know what I mean? And that's probably one of the biggest things I see when I'm out there, is people don't even realise they're doing it.
Can I be really controversial? Is there a time when potting bait's not good?
Yeah.
There's a time when you don't want to use a pole pot.
If you're fishing in the open water, and, you know, potting's great when you're fishing on shells for single fish, 1 or 2 fish. But when you're fishing in open water and you're fishing big lakes, and it's a flat snooker table, basically, like, you sometimes want fish to graze in your peg, and then loose feeding is miles better. You know, open water fishing for F1s, carp, whether it be pinging pellets or loose feeding maggots, pole pots can be too accurate. And then you've got 10 fish in your peg, and you're potting bait in an area this big, and 10 fish cannot feed off a dinner plate that big. So all of a sudden you're foul looking fish. So you actually need to spread the fish out to calm your peg down. Do you know what I mean? It takes you a little bit longer to get a bite, but you're not foul looking them. You've got to give them room to feed. My analogy is always like, if I'm trying to feed 100 people, I put a buffet on. So if you're at a wedding or something like a party, you want to feed a lot of people, you want a buffet, because everybody's got access to the food without queuing up for ages. But if you go home and it's just you and your missus having tea, you know, you're not going to put a buffet on.
No.
You just have 2 plates. That's your plate. This is my plate. You eat off that.
Makes complete sense. And
when you've got a bigger volume of fish in your peg, you need to spread the bait and give them room to graze and room to feed, basically.
Awesome. Feel like we've proper broke down your mindset behind it in that one. Really, really cool.
I'm really big on pots. I think it's a massive thing.
And I'm interested to see what you've got in the pipeline with these new ones that you've been mentioning. Thanks for that, mate. Very interesting. If you enjoyed it, folks, don't forget, like and subscribe. And there's loads of other podcasts with Andy on the podcast playlist, so check them out.